not my speaker's notes or anything. All right, super, thank you. I'm a designer, I need feedback. All right, so I work at Design Map. We've been around for 15 years. We are focused on designing products for our clients who have usually pretty complex products. They're almost always B2B or sometimes healthcare or finance, kind of B2B to C things. So I'm one of 4 partners there, and I was a little bit nervous about speaking here today. I wanted to establish a little bit of credibility with y'all. So I just want to say I wrote my first computer program when I was 5 on a Radio Shack TRS-80, or Trash 80 as they were affectionately known. I studied math and theater in college. My favorite course was non-Euclidean geometry, and my favorite postulate is Euclid's Fifth. And I worked at Netscape in the mid-90s. I worked for the great wise one, as Christian Idiotti appropriately named him. He was my boss there for a while, as well as a lesser-known wise one, Hugh Dubberly, who's one of the great design thinkers of our time, but isn't very good at getting his name out there. And I was in the meeting when Ben Horowitz rolled out his Good Product Managers document. So, and lots and lots of other amazing people at Netscape. And since then, I've worked inside companies as a designer, running design teams, as well as freelanced and consulted for some pretty amazing clients. So hopefully that checks off the credibility box. And I'm going to say, because I'm in presentation mode, I can't see the chat, but I hope that you all can throw questions or comments or whatever in there, and then we should have 5 minutes left in the end. So if you throw them in there as they come up, then I'll go look at them at the end. So I was in my role as a partner at Design Map. We got a phone call from a CEO of a small company, it's like 300 people. And he said to me, look, I was an engineer, so I understand technology. I have learned about marketing and finance and ops and sales, but I haven't learned about design. And I've heard that it's important, but I don't know about it. And I don't know what I should know about it. And I thought that was a really good question. He was calling to ask us to help him learn about it. And I started to think, like, what do we teach him? Like, we're not going to teach him Figma, right? Like, what does he need to know? And so I started calling other people, other leaders out there in the world that were product leaders or entrepreneurs who are great advocates for design, who seem to understand how to use design, how it made a difference for their business, and to try to talk to Kyle, who had called us. And in doing that, I found these lots of overlaps, but like a lot of gaps in their kind of story or understanding or way of thinking about design. And so we decided to write this book, What CEOs Need to Know About Design. It's not that smart of an assignment to give oneself. It's like a long pamphlet. Basically, it's very short, and it's sort of like everything you need to know about the law. It's a big topic, but we try to cover the basics so that we have a shared baseline between designers and CEOs and other business leaders. What business leaders need to know about design is too long of a title, though. I assume that all of you will know 50 to 90% of what I'm about to say, which is just some highlights from the book, but I'm hoping that the 10% that you don't know will be super useful. I'm going to call out opportunities, I think I have called out 7 or 8 highlights or opportunities throughout the talk in this form that are things that you can watch for or think about in terms of how you leverage design in your organization. So we're going to kind of start at the top and talk about investing in design, and specifically how the experts talk about this. I'm sure that you all have seen at least some of these. I'm happy to share the deck and share a list of a lot more of them, but just kind of a quick audit of some of the ways that design is, the value of design is calculated from a top line and bottom line revenue point of view. So this is the Design Management Institute, just looking at, and what almost all of these what all these indexes do is they say, like, okay, here are the characteristics of a design-centric company. In this case, here are the 5 things. And then they looked at how they performed in the S&P 500. And obviously they did significantly better. Here's another one from McKinsey. And I just pulled out a couple of numbers here. Companies with top quartile, their design index scores outperformed in terms of revenue and shareholder returns. There's the Forrester IBM analysis where IBM invested a lot in, they call it design thinking. It's really design. I'm not sure why they called it design thinking, but they saw a 301% ROI in that investment over 3 years. So this report in particular is a couple years old, but it's great. It has a really in-depth index, which has got some really interesting numbers in it. One of the ones that just breaks my heart is they saw before this investment in design, 10% of projects returned no profit or never reached the market. And after their investment in design, that number was cut to 2%. So that means 8% of the stuff that, in particular, engineers, I think of engineers like bleeding and sweating and staying up all night to get these products out the door, 8% of them never realized any revenue at all. I use this to talk to engineers about why they also should be advocating for design in their organizations. Envision has one as well. I'm gonna go a little bit more quickly. There's an interesting one in User Zoom about how CEOs are talking about user experience as a differentiator, either in analyst calls or in all hands meetings. So there's lots of this stuff. I'm happy to share anything that anybody is interested in. Leah Bewley was an analyst with Forrester. No, she was a singer with the band. No, she was an analyst with Forrester, and she audited a pile of these and kind of came up with this sort of mission statement about why organizations should invest in design. So we can point to metrics in reports that support all of these things, that design makes employees more efficient, more productive. They put products in the market more quickly, which are more innovative and drive higher customer lifetime value, ultimately improving the market share and position and growth. So we have data for all of these points. So hopefully we're all at least on the same page that design is worth some thinking in terms of investment. And I would say further, lots of organizations have designers just because they think they should. And it shows in the designers, the way that design is leveraged, in the designer's sense of purpose and commitment. And so I would suggest, expecting your designers to be capable of making a specific, meaningful, and significant contribution to your company's success. And we've hired a lot of designers who are having that kind of impact, but it isn't being recognized or aren't being expected to have that kind of impact, and wonder why they're there. And so this is the reason that we call this out. So assuming that you've decided that you want to invest in design, then you need to bring some designers on. We get asked this all the time, like, what should the ratio be? It varies, but we would say, 1 designer for 8 developers, or if your product is really complex, it might be 4 or 5 developers, but this is kind of the 1 to 8 is kind of the rule of thumb out there in the market. And we would expect salaries for an engineer or for a user experience designer to be about commensurate. So given that, there's this question of, should we have designers in-house in our organization, or should we go look out in the wild for a design partner? This is complicated. It's related to, what's going on in the market in terms of trying to hire designers and the urgency of projects and budgets and all that. But all things being equal, I would say yes to both, actually. So if you have to pick one, the bottom line, and this will sound crazy coming from a consultant, is you should hire. Design is and should be a core competency. But it's not necessarily an either or thing. They can be complementary. So I'm going to look a little bit at both of these. So in terms of the internal hires, assuming that you can, and I'll tell you right now, it's really hard to hire designers, probably just like everybody else. But if you can, just don't expect them to be able to do everything or to be great at everything. And if you put this in a job posting, you are basically, what you're saying is like, I'm kind of naive about what I can expect from you and what your capabilities are going to be. So try to prioritize at least, and that's going to make you look knowledgeable. When you're interviewing them, ask of course, look at their work and see if you like it, but understand that anything in their portfolio is going to be the result of a collaboration between them and their last employer or their teacher, if it's a student. So in addition to that, you want to see the sausage making, like what was the process? How did you get here? So that you can start to get some insight into how they think. It's not that the process is right or wrong, but like how they're approaching problems is really important. I always look for designers who are interested in something besides design. So whether that's the technology and they're asking questions in the interview about the technology stack, or whether that's the business and go-to-market strategy, things like that. But we don't really want to have a designer who believes that design is the end-all be-all. And then finally, when you're reviewing their work, see how they take criticism and if they can absorb kind of probing questions with an open and inquisitive mind. So this is a rule. I broke this rule one time and I regretted it. Always provide feedback or ask a question like, the yellow just doesn't really hold up to me here, or I'm wondering why this information wasn't on that other screen. It seems confusing. And because you're going to be having these kinds of conversations with them all the time, right? And so you want to see how those conversations go. And the response that I'm looking for is very open. Like, oh, interesting. Why do you say that? Or tell me more about that. Or I did try that. If they're defensive, then even though the interview is like an artificial situation, I would pass on them. And then in terms of working with a partner, while you're trying to hire, there's a couple of advantages to doing that. One is that a design partner can come on more quickly. They can actually help you with hiring. So they can do portfolio reviews or even interviews. They can point you to recruiters that are good sources for the kind of candidate that you need. They can review job postings. If you have hired a design consultancy, then you're also demonstrating that you're truly investing in design, and that's going to make you more appealing as an employer to a potential hire. And then having those two work together, that your internal person and this external partner, means that you're going to get more value from the work that you spend with the consultant, because you'll have an internal steward for the work that understands why these decisions were made and what the intents were. So you get more of what you paid for, basically. In terms of hiring design consultants or design partners, I would ask the same question, like, can I see some work in progress? Because you want to understand how they think and how they approach things. Asking about KPIs is great. Strangely, my experience is that clients are hesitant to establish baselines or to establish KPIs. And there's a lot of complexity. As an external consultant, I don't control everything that they do. And there's a lot of moving parts, especially in a B2B situation. And there's other requests and requirements and schedules and things. But if you can get KPIs or some kind of success measures out of them from past clients, I would definitely ask to see those. How they hand off, what happens at the end of their engagement, and also what don't they do. There are lots of design consultancies out there in the world or design agencies, and especially if they use the word agency, to be honest, I would expect that they probably are like an advertising or marketing firm that saw that there's more opportunity out there and tried to tack on software design as a competency that might not be their strength. So I would expect them to be able to say, we don't do this. We don't do X, Y, or Z. This is really our specialty. And little secret, if you want them to love you and like feel like you're their favorite client, asking them in this process, like what they would need from you, what kinds of time and information and investment they would need from you outside of the money, is a great way to start that relationship off right. In any event, it's not great to be a design team of one. There's a book called Design Team of One, but we've hired a lot of folks who were that, and they felt isolated. They felt like there was no opportunity for career growth or learning. If they got stuck on a problem, they couldn't move. They struggled to get unstuck because they didn't have anybody to bounce ideas off of. So as quickly as possible, either try to hire two or use an outside consultant so that they have a cohort, just like you would for an engineer. They're probably not going to be thrilled to be the only engineer on the team for a long time. Okay, so we've decided to invest and we've hired, and now we're actually working together. And I was just listening this morning to Rajesh talking about talking to customers. A lot of designers get trained in how to talk to customers. And so you may ask them to lead the conversations and for you to ride along. If they're not leading the conversations because they don't have time, you don't have them, or they don't have training, then I would just caution you with this little story. There was some research conducted where a researcher was out on the sidewalk with a clipboard, a bunch of papers, and a drink. And they were asking people if they'd participate in the research. And when people said yes, they said, "Oh, okay, can you just hold this drink for me?" And they pull out a photograph of a person, take the drink back. So the drink changed hands for maybe 30 seconds. And then they'd say, "Okay, can you look at the picture of this person and just tell me your impressions of this person?" And if the research participant was given a warm drink to hold, they were more likely to have a positive perception of that photograph than if they were given a cold drink to hold. So all of that is to say, if something as subtle as the temperature of a drink that someone is holding for 30 seconds can impact how they respond to questions, imagine what your charisma, right? You are all entrepreneurs. So you're charismatic, you're great evangelists, you're great at getting people on board. If you're product manager, you're probably not the boss of anybody. The way that you're successful in your job is to be that charismatic person that people want to agree with and help. And you really have to set that aside. Or another way to put it, I actually was reading this book, Flora and Ulysses, to my daughter last night. And she says, like, her theme as a cynic is do not hope, instead observe, right? So when you're talking to those folks, don't hope for validation, don't hope to be proven right or wrong or anything. Don't hope to prove your boss wrong, just observe and really like set aside that hat of charisma and the best looking person in the room that most of you probably have. Because then all you're going to learn is, yep, you are in fact charismatic. And it's almost worse than not talking to customers at all if this is done poorly. And I've seen it done poorly because there's a perception that there's been some learning when in fact there hasn't. The next point is about working deeply. So this is a framework from this book, The Elements of User Experience Design by Jesse James Garrett. He was one of the founders of Adaptive Path. It's a really early kind of touch point in the development of the design profession. And so I'm sharing it with you here because I think it helps to have a common language. And he talks about this kind of like depth from surface through these kinds of skeleton and scope to strategy. I redrew it because it's ugly and it's hard to manage vertically, but basically it ranges from sort of fonts and colors at the surface all the way down to design thinking, strategy kinds of approaches. And then there's things in between that I'm not going to go through because we don't have time. So it's a designer's job to do all of this stuff, or at least to help with all of this stuff. And one of the mistakes that's really common is this expectation that design is just fonts and colors. If you read, I'm sure many of you read Marty Kagan, right? And what Marty talks about is that 4 kinds of risk. And one of them is usability, which is more related to fonts and colors, but one of them is also value. And designers can't help manage that value risk if they're not involved. Also, most of them will go nuts and leave your company if they're only involved at a superficial level. On the other hand, I've started to hear my friend Peter Merholz was just telling me that he's seeing the kind of the opposite problem where there's a tiny team and a big company, which you guys probably don't have this problem, but this idea that, oh, well, we did a design thinking exercise to figure out our strategy, therefore we've done design. We've like checked the design box, and it similarly is a problem. So working together, the designer is going to do some stuff from strategy, scope, structure, skeleton to surface, and then they're going to share it with you, and you're going to give feedback. At some point, hopefully, you can step away, right? When you get to those higher levels, you could depend on their expertise. But at the lower levels, you're going to be asked to give feedback. And I wonder how many of you have had this happen. There's like a designer, you can tell the designer has the hip glasses, and they present something, and then somebody in the room is like, oh my God, I love the blue. The blue is really great, or I hate it, or whatever. And the designer's like, no, that color is just to indicate that there's action. Like, we're not actually using that color. And the designer looks defensive, and the person who gave the feedback looks kind of clueless. So we coach designers to say, walking into a meeting, this is the kind of feedback that I need. And even this is the kind of feedback that I don't need. Not worried about colors, not worried about typos, not even really worried about the copy at this point, but we would like to hear about X and Y. And if they don't, then ask them what kind of feedback you need. Because in this model, the kind of feedback that's appropriate at the strategic level is completely inappropriate at the surface level, right? And vice versa. So the second recommendation with regards to feedback is to focus on intent. I don't know what the icon is for intent. It's like there's a clear arrow that's obscured by, some things. So users have intent, right? That's what we're trying to support. And the designer is keeping the user's intent in mind. And at the same time, the business has a certain intent, and the designer is kind of squaring those with perhaps their own, like they want to do hipster scrolling or something like that. And you all, as entrepreneurs, business owners, product managers, business leaders, have a unique perspective to see all of it. So when I say focus on intent, that usually means asking a lot of questions. So asking questions about the user's intent. How do they do it today? How is this making it better? What's the most important thing to them on this page? Asking about the designer's intent as well is really important. So which version do you like? And why did you do it this way? And how is this feedback process going for you? Dirty little secret is that managing a feedback process is really hard. There's usually more people that want to opine than is really helpful or even necessarily relevant. And designers are often introverted for whatever reason. I would say well over half of them are. So they're trying to manage all these things coming at them, which may be asynchronous. And so you as a business leader are definitely well positioned to help them manage taking that feedback in and the whole process of feedback itself. And then finally, of course, state your own intent and the business's intent. So that might be around aligning more to the vision. It might be because the CEO had an idea in the shower and it needs to show up somewhere. It might be, something more tactical like conversion goals. But of course, that's what you're doing. And here you'll notice that I'm mostly asking questions, right? Eliciting intent or explaining your own and asking how it can be better addressed. But I yesterday was in a call, and I've been in so many of these in the years of my career, where a very senior leader of a very large company was asking questions about how scroll bars, like where to put the scroll bar and whether something should be a line or an arrow. And I think that he did that because he doesn't know how he can add more value. And the way that he could add more value is to describe and to ask about his intent, customers' intent, the rest of the business's intent. Last point on working together is just designers design all the things. So many times we've come across these situations where it's like, oh, they did the key screens and then the engineers figured it out, or they did the web-based version and the engineers figured out the mobile version, or they had to go to a different project, and so from then on the product managers were doing wireframes. And these are symptoms of larger problems that I'll just say, like, somebody is doing the design. It's best if you spend your money on a person who's good at design, doing design, rather than spending your money on somebody who doesn't have much training or experience in design. So we're all product led. That shouldn't be a problem, but I'm just putting that out there. So in terms of 3 ideas for how you might work differently tomorrow, maybe look at one of those reports, the indices that I called out. Pick one, give yourself a score, and set a goal for where you want your maturity to be. Ask your designer or your design team where they think they have the most impact and where they wish they had more, to try to address the kind of depth problem. And then finally, maybe try attending a review and only asking questions, like the Socratic method of feedback, and not making any statements, and just see what happens.